Okay, good morning, everyone. Thank you for coming Saturday morning. It's a good day today. Our weather is good, and we'll learn about some atrial fibrillation. So, you guys, I'm going to keep this as more interactive than just talking my part. You can interrupt me in the middle and go on and continue, ask questions, and then I'll go, and then I go to the next one. Okay? So, don't hesitate to ask questions. Okay, so as you all know, my name is Sujata Balulad, and we are going to talk about atrial fibrillation. How does the heart work? What is AFib and the correlation between AFib and stroke? Other treatment options and educational resources. Okay. So this is my credentials. I did my schooling in Mumbai, and then I did my residency in upstate New York and cardiology in upstate New York, and then I did my fellowship in electrophysiology in Leahy Clinic and Mount Sinai, New York. So, and then I came down to Florida. I've been here in this area 5 years. So, just quickly, how does the heart work? We have two upper chambers and two lower chambers. So upper chambers receive the blood. The right upper chamber receives blood from the body, and then it goes down to the right lower chamber, and from there the blood gets pumped to the lungs, and where it gets oxygenated, and then comes to the left atrium, and then from left atrium goes down to the left ventricle, and then it gets pumped to the body, which is oxygenated blood to the whole body. Okay. So what is AFib? I'm gonna have you guys watch this video. It's the loudest here. That's the loudest. Oh, okay. Thank you. Is that better?
Resulting in quivering or fibrillation of the atria. Fibrillation can cause your blood to stagnate and form clots. For this reason, one of the biggest concerns for patients with atrial fibrillation is risk for stroke, as clots may reach the brain, causing a stroke. In fact, AFib increases the patient's risk of stroke and heart failure 5-fold and can negatively affect quality of life. Medication known as anticoagulants, a special type of blood thinner, are prescribed by a physician to reduce your stroke risk. AFib is also a chronic progressive disease that may worsen if untreated. Episodes of AFib can be short, lasting for brief periods of time. This is called paroxysmal AFib. Episodes over time can prolong. Episodes lasting over 7 days is known as persistent AFib and results from structural changes to your heart due to underlying risk factors. 1 to 5 patients progress from paroxysmal to persistent in 1 year. For this reason, early diagnosis and treatment is essential. To find more information on your treatment options, including catheter ablation, go to www.getsmartaboutafib.com.
Okay, what happens to the heart during AFib? So you saw like in the video, but in addition to that, as I mentioned, how the blood gets pumped from upper chamber to lower chamber, then to the body. When you have AFib, when you are in AFib, the upper chambers are not like pumping like synchronously with the lower chamber. So upper chamber will go like a million tiny little circuits are all start firing at the same time. Normally your sinus node starts the beat, it goes to AV node, and then it goes down to the lower chamber. But when you have in AFib, you have like million tiny little circuits all working at the same time. So you have like 400 beats per minute or 500 beats per minute. Upper chamber is going that fast. Thankfully, we have what we call as a filter in the middle called AV node. It does not allow all the beats to go down. Otherwise, we could not live. We could die. So the AV node does the filtering work, but still, even with the AV node, the lower chambers do go fast. Like it goes like more than 100, 150, 200. So at that time, you're going to feel like palpitations, shortness of breath, like as if you're running a marathon, basically. Some people can pass out. Some people may not feel the symptoms, like, what in the video it said silent AFib. They may not have any symptoms, or they may have very subtle symptoms that they may be blaming it to their age or something like that. So, you could have shortness of breath, or you could have tiredness or fatigue, may not have like, full-blown symptoms of AFib like palpitations and all. And again, some people are on medications, so their AFib may not be like at 200 or 150. It may be low, like it may be 100. It may be even lower than 100. Even when the rate is controlled, you can still have like symptoms like tiredness and fatigue, because your upper chamber, when it is in AFib, it is not emptying well. It's just quivering like this. So it's not emptying it to the lower chambers well. So the cardiac output, like it will empty only partially. So the lower chambers don't get enough blood, and when the lower chambers pump to the body, then the body gets less than what it is used to or is supposed to. So that is the other reason why you're tired and fatigued, and even though you may not have palpitations, or you may have all of these symptoms. Okay. So now also the AFib, population is increasing. The prevalence of AFib in our population is increasing. By 2035, we will have about 12 million people that will have AFib, and that's because we're growing elderly population, so we are doing well in prevention. So we are our people are living longer. So living longer means you are higher risk for AFib. As we get old, we are higher risk for AFib. And improved AFib diagnostic procedure. So last 20-30 years, we are doing good in diagnosing AFib. Before people had AFib, we didn't know, so they were not counted. So we thought AFib prevalence is not much. Now we are diagnosing it more, so now we have more people. And also improved survival rates, and also people are living longer because of other heart or other body conditions like coronary artery disease, cancer, all those things. We are treating them better, so people are living longer. The life expectancy is going up, and that's why now we are seeing more AFib. And lifestyle factors too. We are not taking care of ourselves, like obesity, the blood pressure is high. So those are all increasing the risk for AFib, and now we have more AFib. Okay, so and other important thing, like lot of other conditions, like other arrhythmias or other conditions of the heart, most of them are curable, or we can get rid of them. But AFib is something, it's a progressive disease. It is not like you have urinary tract infection, you took antibiotics, and now it's all good. You're not going to have AFib. It's not like that. AFib is a progressive disease. You are going to keep having AFib, and it is a progressive disease. If you don't control it well, it gets worse faster. Like, in and out of phase of AFib, the initial phase is called paroxysmal AFib. And then it goes into early persistent. Early persistent means like you are in AFib continuously for 7 days. Okay, that's by definition is early persistent. And if you stay like, it's about like, if you stay like that for a longer period, for more than a month, it's called like, persistent. And then if you're in it for further longer, like a year and all, it's called late persistent. And if it continues like that, after a couple of years, it becomes permanent AFib. So when you get to permanent AFib, it's very hard to get you back to normal rhythm. Pretty much you just end up staying in AFib. So these earlier phases like paroxysmal, early persistent, late persistent are the time where you have to aggressively work on AFib. Again, late persistent, your success of the, in general is less. Then, it's going to be harder to control AFib when you go to late persistent. So the best time to really work hard at it, like not to lose it, like the early part, like paroxysmal AFib. And even if you lose that, just at least start working on it early persistent. Don't let it cross like early persistent, then it is going to get harder and harder. Okay? And what it says is 20% of the patients actually go from paroxysmal AFib to persistent AFib within 1 year. And also it depends on your risk factors. See, like all the patients come and tell me that, oh, my friend had this, my friend had ablation, it didn't help him. But every patient is different. You cannot compare yourself with your next door neighbor or even in your own family. So the risk factors, I'm going to explain that in the next slide. If you have more risk factors, or if your risk factors for AFib is not controlled well, then your AFib is going to progress faster. So in this, it says 20% go from paroxysmal to persistent in 1 year. There may be people crossing that within less than 1 year, or there may be people going to persistent it may take 3-4 years. So everybody is different. Go ahead.
So the slides that you showed us, are those just the handouts that we got? So that we can look at that and read it there?
No, we don't have the handouts, but this video will be uploaded to our website.
Oh, cool.
So you can watch it. Okay, so yeah, so every patient with AFib is different. And the other important thing we are going to emphasize is, if you take care of your AFib by getting catheter ablation, the studies have shown that there is 10 times less likely you're going to progress from paroxysmal to persistent. So your risk of progressing to persistent is less if you get the catheter ablation done. That's the studies show. And now the risk factors that I mentioned. What are all the risk factors that are modifiable, and which risk factors are non-modifiable? The modifiable risk factors are like smoking, weight or caffeine consumption or stress, things like that, alcohol consumption and sleep apnea. These are modifiable. So like you have to wear CPAP machine to control your sleep apnea. Sleep apnea can trigger AFib, and and it is seen. A lot of people, when I see the patients with AFib, and I talk to them, you need to work on especially these three things: blood pressure, weight, and sleep apnea. They say, "Oh, I don't have sleep apnea," but have you been tested for it? The reason why I'm emphasizing this is a lot of people do not even know that they have sleep apnea. Snoring is not sleep apnea. Snoring means you most likely have sleep apnea. Sleep apnea means you, in the middle of the night, you stop breathing, and then you wake up and go back to again start breathing again. So these are called apneic episodes, and these apneic spells are called sleep apnea, and that affects your heart. That triggers AFib because it causes hypoxia, and it triggers AFib when you go into AFib. So if you control your sleep apnea, then your episodes of AFib reduce, and that way it reduces the progression. So the more episodes of AFib means worse your AFib is going to get. So we have to make sure that your episodes do not happen again and again. So the more you have, like you have one episode leads to 4 leads to 16, like that. It just gets worse exponentially. So that is why, whether if you go for ablation or even in the beginning phase, if you're taking medication, a lot of people are like, oh, I don't like taking medicine. But the goal is not to have any episode of AFib. Reduce the episodes to as minimum as possible. so it does not progress. Okay, and other things that you can modify is like weight and blood pressure. Weight, if you actually control your weight, it helps with blood pressure. It also helps with sleep apnea. So you're actually like technically taking care of one thing, and your other things are going to be taken care along with it if you think about it. Okay, so that's, weight is the biggest thing, like that will help other things like blood pressure. And the diet is very important too, not just for losing weight. If you watch your salt intakes, or your blood pressure is going to be controlled. If your blood pressure stays controlled, then your AFib stays in control. Okay, so how, question is, does the AFib affects the quality of life? Yes, the biggest thing about AFib is it affects your quality of life. And few people, like 10-20% of them, end up having stroke if you don't take blood thinner, or and few people, if you don't take care of your AFib, go into heart failure. And then also, if you don't take care of it, it increases your mortality. Mortality means your death from heart failure. But AFib increases your risk of heart failure 5 times, and also AFib increases your risk of stroke 5 times. So if you control your AFib, you're controlling, you have good quality of life, and it, reduces your stroke risk. Along with, you have to take blood thinner, and plus it reduces the risk of heart failure. Okay. AFib and stroke. Regardless if you have symptoms or don't have symptoms, you are at risk for stroke if you have AFib. So a lot of people also tell me that I don't feel AFib, so maybe I don't have. So if it is already established that you have AFib, either by EKG or if you're in the hospital on telemetry, then you have AFib. It is not going to happen every day to define that you have AFib. Once you had AFib, you have AFib. Unless there are very few times where you can say your AFib is not there anymore, it went away. Those are if you had, heart surgery and you never had AFib before, and right after the heart surgery or during the heart surgery, you went into AFib. And that also we closely monitor them, because they may have had AFib before and they didn't know. So we want to establish that. Is this only because of the surgery, or it happened if patient has AFib? So we follow them afterwards for 3 months to see if they are having AFib or not. And those are the only time. And then if you have very high thyroid levels, that can cause AFib, and that is something, if you take care of your thyroid levels, your AFib will go away. Or if you're a young kid and had a binge drinking, and then you had AFib from that, these are the only times the AFib will go away. Otherwise, if you have AFib, you have AFib. And if you're above 60 and you had one episode of AFib, that means you have AFib, because age is one of the biggest risk factors. And one of the most common cause of AFib is high blood pressure. So, and there are some patients, they say, I don't have high blood pressure, but they have AFib. That's likely because of their family history or other cardiac condition, coronary artery disease, heart failure, valvular issues like mitral valve regurgitation, like leaky valve, mitral valve can cause AFib. Okay, so these are the other reasons. So if you are 30, 40 and you are having AFib, so we try to make sure that it is something you are going to have it, or it happened because of some other reasons, we look for it. But if you are 60 and you have AFib and you don't have major things like very high thyroid levels, then most likely you have AFib. It does not go away. And that means you need to protect yourself from stroke, and you need to start working on controlling AFib. And again, some people say, I know every time I have AFib because I feel it. Not everybody feels it. You can, that's why they did the study on a bunch of people that said they feel AFib, and they found out that a lot of those people did not know 100% of the time when they were in AFib. That's another thing. This is why we are worried when patient says, I don't have AFib, I'm going to stop taking blood. The risk is like stroke. stroke is devastating. So you have to be very careful when you say I don't have AFib. So just remember, if you have AFib, you have AFib for rest of your life. Okay, it's a progressive disease like diabetes. Okay, go ahead.
So, when you had a heart surgery, you always felt bad and no. So, while I was in the hospital, something was wrong. I was in the hospital midnight. So, that's why I don't know, something's not right. And it was day. And so, it was down to call that overdose. And I was on the last medication and take a home. I don't want to go home.
Right.
So I had 10 days, then we was done. So I thought, well, that was all I did, just like you said. So, over 3 years later, I was old. I went to pick up the bowling ball and I was standing there. They said, bowl. I said, I can't bowl. I said, the ball now, because like you said, you get down, I do it. So I went to the hospital. They thought I had a heart attack.
Yeah.
So,
It didn't come back. I don't know. It's very, very hard to prove. If your first AFib was because of the heart surgery, it maybe you had AFib and heart surgery triggered it, and then it was calm for a few months or few years, and then it appeared again. It's not like it was gone. It maybe was there, or both of them were completely different, like not related to each other. You may have had AFib in the setting of surgery and that resolved, and then 3 years later you may have had AFib like any other person has AFib.
so the amiodarone,
Amiodarone, nothing can get rid of AFib. Amiodarone, if it is post cardiac surgery AFib, it goes away. The reason we give amiodarone to help you to convert and not just stay in AFib. And then after, and then it on its own it should resolve. And then when you come back and see us in the office, we check and make sure you're converted back to normal rhythm. We do monitor and then follow up. At some point, if we don't see AFib, we tell you can come off the blood thinner. But that's just the post cardiac surgery AFib. But in any other setting, like if they had bowel surgery or if they had any other surgery, leg surgery, neck surgery, and they go into AFib, that's because you have AFib. The surgery did not cause AFib, okay? That stress of going through the surgery triggered your AFib. So that means you have AFib. It's only cardiac surgery can cause short-term AFib that can go away. But again, even in those patients, we monitor very closely. We don't just say, okay, you're done, you're never going to have AFib. We just, monitor them. If they ever have any symptoms, we do monitor and, keep on keeping a close eye on them. But in any other setting of AFib, people say, oh, I had pneumonia and I had AFib. No, pneumonia did not cause AFib. Pneumonia triggered AFib, but you have AFib. Okay, you understand? So there is a theory of AFib. What they say is there is something called substrate and there is a trigger. Substrate is your upper chamber, both upper chambers. Substrate means the thing that maintains AFib, that continues AFib. Trigger means that makes you go into AFib. Okay, and that trigger is not the cause of AFib, it just makes you go into AFib. So substrate, you have to understand, a lot of, AFib did not happen overnight in one day. So the changes, the substrate for AFib starts happening many years before you first see AFib. So because of the high blood pressure or valvular issues. So in upper chambers, you start having like scarring, fibrosis, and that causes these electrical issues. And at one day when you have pneumonia or you had surgery, and those triggers push you into go into AFib, and this substrate, maintains AFib. You understand those two things. If you have to have substrate for AFib for you to go into AFib. And all the pneumonia, all other surgery they are triggers. You have substrate, that's why you're going to AFib. So think about it. A lot of people go have surgeries. Not everybody goes into AFib. You know, if you had like bowel surgery and 90% of them go into AFib, then you can say, yeah, the surgery caused it. But it's not everybody goes and has it. I mean, yeah, cardiac surgery, a lot of them, because think about it, when you have cardiac surgery, they cut it, you know, there is a lot of inflammation. That inflammation and healing, that irritates the heart and it goes into AFib. Again, when you have bowel surgery or other surgery, you shouldn't have irritation in the heart. Okay, so that those other surgeries or other medical conditions are just trigger for AFib. They do not cause AFib. You guys understand that? So this is the reason I keep saying, once you have AFib, you have AFib. This is why the substrate, we cannot change the substrate. What we do is we slow down the progression by reducing the AFib episode so that substrate does not get worse and your episodes do not increase, and you just stay in that state longer duration. Instead of going from paroxysmal to persistent immediately, it take like few years. And again, if you control your risk factors like weight, blood pressure, other things like alcohol, smoking and all, that also helps. So it's not just us who can help you with AFib. You have to do a lot of changes, lifestyle changes, and that will help to reduce these episodes. Reduction of the episode means slowing of the progression. Even ablation, what we do is, if you get it done very early on in the disease process, it reduces it slows down the progression. It's in some patients it's almost like cure, but it's not cure. If someone tells you ablation causes cure, it's wrong. I'll be honest with you. So think about it. If the substrate started many years before you started having episodes of AFib, that means that substrate was going on. We cannot change fibrosis or scar. We can only slow it down further getting worse. So we cannot cure AFib. You got it? So it doesn't go away. It's there. It's controlled. Okay? No, I'll explain you how the ablation. Yeah, I'll explain you how the ablation works. We do not change the substrate, even in ablation. We only control the trigger, and I'll explain you more. Okay? And the link between AFib and stroke. So why do you get stroke, and why AFib puts you at a risk of stroke? So think about it, like when it's a flowing water and the stagnant water. Flowing water is clean, right? Wherever the water is flowing and that area is clean and the water is clean. But a stagnant water over time will collect mud, and it's not clean, right? So same thing, when you have AFib, your upper chambers are not contracting vigorously and not moving the blood vigorously, and its upper chamber is quivering. So the blood stays in the upper chamber for a longer time, and that causes clot formation. And that clot can get released and go to not just the brain, to the other organs also. But other organs are not as devastating as stroke. So that's why we emphasize more on the stroke. So that's why we give what we call as oral anticoagulants or blood thinner, like Eliquis or Alto, Pradaxa or Dabigatran, warfarin. Okay, aspirin and Plavix are not blood thinner. They are antiplatelet. They're not anticoagulant, they're antiplatelet. They cannot be used to prevent stroke. That's another thing people keep saying, but I'm already on blood thinner. No, they make you they put you at a risk for bleeding, but they're not blood thinner or they're not anticoagulants. Aspirin and Plavix are antiplatelet. They just do not allow the platelets to stick to each other. Okay, in a simple language. So they don't dissolve the clot. Okay. So that is why you get stroke, because from AFib. There are a lot of other arrhythmias, they do not put you at a risk for stroke, but AFib and atrial flutter, they both put you at a risk for stroke for this reason, and that's why you need to take blood thinner. And again, who is at a higher risk for stroke is based on your risk factor. We calculate your risk factor, like your age, if you have congestive heart failure, if you have had prior stroke, you have high blood pressure, your diabetes. So we give you points for that. If your point is 1, you're at a low risk. Again, it's not no risk, it's low risk. And 2 is intermediate risk. And anytime it goes to 3 or above 3 is considered high risk. So once you are high risk, you have to take it. Even you get ablation done, you have to take blood thinner, unless you opt for Watchman. Go ahead. Baby aspirin is not a blood thinner. So Eliquis is a blood thinner. I mean, if you have a condition like coronary artery disease or had a prior stroke, you may have to take that for those conditions, and Eliquis you may have to take for AFib. Yes. Yeah. So if you are on both of them, then you have to ask your doctor, why am I on both? So they'll explain you. You may have had a stroke in the past, or had a MI or myocardial infarction or heart attack, or you have a stent in the heart or in the legs. So you do need baby aspirin or Plavix, depending on what is better. You understand? So that's not for AFib. That's for other conditions, and you have to, and that doesn't cover your AFib. That will not cover your AFib. It's the same way if you have a stent, Eliquis is not going to cover. You need to take Plavix or aspirin or both, depending on whatever your doctors say. You guys understand? They have a specific role. They do what they're supposed to do, but it cannot cover everything. One is called anticoagulants, they dissolve the clot. Other one is called antiplatelets. Okay. We just call like everything as blood thinner, which is wrong. So I keep on correcting my patients and trying to explain them. If you understand both of these, they have their own roles. They cannot be used for like any blood thinner. Okay. So other important thing about stroke and the AFib, more than 90% of the clots are formed in this part of the heart. It's called left atrial appendage. When people have AFib, clot in their heart from AFib, 90% of the time the clot gets formed in that part of the heart, because it's a small area. It's like a pouch. The blood does not go in and out vigorously, so it forms the clot 90% of the time. And then nearly 1/3 of the strokes, in general, strokes are caused by AFib. Strokes can happen because of that. It can be ischemic stroke. That means that cholesterol plaque gets released and can block small vessels in your brain. That's called ischemic stroke. And this is the clot gets released from the heart and goes to the heart. It's called embolic stroke. Okay, this is a different kind of stroke, not the ischemic stroke. For ischemic stroke, the neurologist will give you aspirin or Plavix and the cholesterol medicine like statin. For embolic stroke, you have to be on blood thinners like anticoagulant like Eliquis, Xarelto, and all. Okay, and there are other reasons for stroke too, like very high blood pressure, like a lot of other reasons for stroke too, but these are the main. So like 1/3 of the stroke is embolic. Thankfully, it's not 2/3, it's 1/3. 2/3 is more other strokes. The reason why I'm saying is thankfully it's less is because the strokes that are caused by AFib are very devastating. They're more severe. Recovering from that it takes longer time, and almost you will have that neurologic deficit, may not be reversed fully, even after doing physical therapy and all like that. So that is the other reason we have to be very careful with making sure you're covered for stroke when you have AFib. Okay. So now we are going to talk about treatment options. So again, after all these explanation I gave you, is it important to act quickly when the AFib is diagnosed? Yeah. Okay, mainly because of the stroke. You don't want to get stroke. Unfortunately, there are a lot of patients we see in the hospital. They come with a stroke and then we find out they had AFib. So those are very devastating because these patients did not even get a chance to take care of themselves. Okay. Again, AFib is a progressive disease, so it's important to seek treatment as soon as possible to improve quality of life, control the arrhythmia, and reduce the risk of stroke. Okay. So how is AFib is managed? There are different ways of managing. Mainly, like one is like main thing is stroke prevention that we talk. We're going to talk more about it later. And the other one is how are we going to keep patients in normal rhythm or control the heart rate. So rate control. The rate control is the old way of treating AFib. It is not preferred anymore. Rate control means we used to do that before 2002. After 2002, it was proven that rate control is not better than rhythm control. So rate control means, as its name says, you stay in AFib or you not stay in AFib, your heart rate is controlled. So when you're resting, it's around 70, 80. When you're active, it will go up, but not like really high. So that is basically, so you are given medications like metoprolol, cardizem to keep your heart rate controlled. No matter, doesn't matter whether you are in AFib or normal rhythm, doesn't matter. That's rate control. The second one is rhythm control. That means the goal is to keep you in normal rhythm, not in AFib. So the rhythm control is, and the rate control will happen automatically if you're if you are trying hard to keep your normal rhythm, your rate will be controlled anyways. So the reason behind that, sinus rhythm is normal, and we all want to be normal, and the rhythm should be normal, and so you can have normal life, no symptoms from AFib. The other reason, rate control, it controls your rate. Even when the AFib is in controlled rate, still there is reduction in the emptying of the blood from the upper chamber to lower chamber. You're still going to have tiredness, fatigue, shortness of breath. So that is the reason why rate control is not as good as rhythm control. Yes, metoprolol is rate controlled, but it does suppress AFib in the early phases of AFib. So it is not an antiarrhythmic to convert you from AFib. You may convert on your own while you're taking metoprolol because metoprolol is constantly suppressing the AFib. It suppresses the AFib, yes. Yeah, I mean pretty much everybody that has AFib are on metoprolol. But in addition to that, you will need another strong medicine if you go with only medication option. But
that's where the rhythm control comes in.
Yes, another medicine. Yeah, so rhythm control, I'll show you some video also, you will understand better. So the rhythm control will have medications like metoprolol and other medicines like in the initial phases. As it gets worse, you're going to go with the stronger medicine called antiarrhythmic medicine, and then catheter ablation, that or the catheter ablation. So they all are in the rhythm control. Okay, and also the lifestyle changes, as I mentioned, and the procedure, ablation procedure. Okay, there you go.
Categorized into two categories, rate control and rhythm control. Rate control uses medications to slow your heart rate. This does not prevent or reduce episodes, but it can support symptom control by controlling your pulse. Rhythm control is more focused on preventing AFib episodes and restoring your heart back to normal rhythm. Rhythm control can be further categorized into short-term or longer-term strategies. Short term may refer to a cardioversion, either through medicine or a controlled low-dose shock under sedation, which can quickly terminate an episode of AFib in order to reduce symptoms. However, cardioversions are associated with high rates of occurrences as they do not prevent future events of AFib. Longer-term strategies of rhythm control involve antiarrhythmic drug therapy and/or catheter ablation. Antiarrhythmic drugs are medications which you take daily and work to suppress those impulses from the top chambers of the heart. For over 50% of AFib patients, drug therapy is ineffective or cannot be tolerated due to negative side effects. If medications don't work or give you negative side effects, ask your doctor about catheter ablation. Catheter ablation is a low-risk, minimally invasive outpatient procedure with a low rate of risks such as bleeding, swelling, or bruising at the insertion site. Catheter ablation uses radio frequency to block abnormal electrical signals that cause AFib and restore a normal heartbeat. Patients receiving catheter ablation have been shown to be up to 73% more likely to be symptom-free at 4 years when compared to patients receiving drug therapy, and 10 times less likely to progress to persistent AF. As a result, benefits of catheter ablation may include symptom relief, improved quality of life, and long-term reduction of stroke risk. To find more information on your treatment options, go to www.getsmartaboutafib.com and see an electrophysiologist near you.
Okay, so quickly, you guys asked me about how does if AFib ablation changes the substrate. AFib ablation does not change the substrate. What ablation does is we reduce the trigger. So in the first step of ablation, what we target, like it's same for everybody. If this is your first ablation, everybody has the similar ablation. Everybody gets what we call as pulmonary vein isolation. So that is always the first step for all the patients with AFib. And if you come back, like then we do different things based on what you need. But the first step is same all the time. And if you get that done early on, you don't need other steps. So the first step, we call it as pulmonary vein isolation. So what the pulmonary veins, they bring oxygenated blood from lungs to the heart. So that's their job. But they're also electrically active. We don't need their electrical activity, but they cause what we call as PACs or extra beats. And those PACs are increased either your sleep apnea, or you have lung issues going on, bad COPD or pneumonia or if you are in stress, and those they cause extra beats coming from these pulmonary veins. These extra beats can come from other places too, like the upper chamber itself. But 90% of the time they come from the pulmonary veins. And what we do in ablation, we electrically separate the pulmonary veins from rest of the upper chamber. So that way, these triggers, which are the PACs or extra beats, they are controlled. And even if they are happening, they're not allowed to come inside the heart. So that does not affect your heart. So these PACs trigger your AFib, and you have that, if you have that substrate that we mentioned, like fibrosis and all because of high blood pressure or whatever the reason is, that substrate, if you have that substrate with those PACs, you go into AFib, and that substrate maintains the AFib. You understand? And as you have more and more trigger, then it increases your AFib episode, and that substrate keeps getting worse, and then it makes you go into more AFib and more, and that way it becomes from controlled AFib to a not controlled, and you have more, and it gets worse and progresses. So all we do is controlling the trigger even with ablation. But it is better controlled that way than medication, because medication is basically also suppresses these triggers, but it also makes you like tired, fatigued, because it's affecting the whole body. Ablation is specifically taking care of the problem. Like, if 90% of the trigger is coming from pulmonary veins and we are separating them electrically only, okay, it's not mechanical separation, because we need the pulmonary veins to bring blood from the heart, but we only separate them electrically, so we don't have these extra beats. So that controls, and it's one time you get it done and you're good, unless it opens up. So that is what we do second time. When people start having more episodes, we go back in, and first thing we check whatever we did in the first ablation is still intact or not, because that is still the major treatment. Like, that helps you the most, that separating electrically the pulmonary veins from the upper chamber. So even in the second ablation, we go back and check that part. If that part is not intact, it's opened up, we go back and redo that, because in some people they heal when we don't want them to heal. Again, even though like we double check, we give medicine to make sure that line is complete, there is no opening in it, but it can happen. People over time can heal there, and then these extra beats starts coming back and start again triggering AFib. So that is what we do in ablation. Go ahead. What is the so there is no one answer. So there is, every patient is different, right? And like, if I like see, for example, I have one patient, he is not morbidly obese, not even obese, and he has no high blood pressure, and he has family history only as the risk factors, and he starts having AFib, and we take care of it early on, do ablation, medications, and he's taken care of the blood thinner, and and he has maintained his lifestyle, stays active, and has does not acquire other risk factors. They may not need another thing done for years, and 5 years or 6 years, I'm not, I don't know, depending on that. So, and on the other hand, I have another patient, like maybe BMI of 35, obese, high blood pressure, diabetes, and a lot of risk factors, and they come in, and they came in early on, and I did ablation early on. Yes, it helped them for 2 years or something. It's very well controlled, but they have AFib, they have high blood pressure, their weight and sleep apnea. They didn't take care of it. It will come back sooner. Again, only treatment what we give is not what helps. Everything has to be done. Again, I know it's hard to lose weight. It is hard to do all of this. In an ideal world, yeah, we all want to be in perfect health, perfect weight. It is hard, and as we age, it gets harder and harder. But we have to make an attempt. We have to make an attempt, start changing, and if you don't do that, you'll have AFib episode starts coming early, and then and again, other risk factors, like if somebody may not be very obese but have heart failure and not treated well, okay, that can cause more AFib, or valvular issues that's not treated, so that can cause more AFib. So every patient is different depending on what is their reason for AFib and what other risk factors they have. Go ahead.
So since September 4th, I had my ablation. Everything's been good. It's been good.
Okay, good.
I have a deeply aortic valve.
Mhm.
No more.
Okay, good. Yeah, I mean, most of my patients, even when they don't take care of the other risk factors, they do pretty good, even though they didn't come in the very early phases. Most of them come in the early persistent or late persistent. I wish they all came very early on. Then their success would be up to 90%. But most of them come in the early persistent and late persistent. So their success, time-wise, for what? Again, that's different for everybody. Yes, I can't tell you by time. I can tell you by how your AFib is. If it is coming, you're going in and out on your own, that's still paroxysmal. And if you stay in it continuously for minimum of 7 days, that means it's persistent. And if you needed to be cardioverted or needed to be taken medications like antiarrhythmic, like amiodarone, that means you are already persistent. Okay, so that is how you define, not by time. Time is different for everybody. Okay.
So, I wasn't in that neighborhood for a long time,
Yeah.
but when I was bowling and I did something wrong, that was 3 years later.
Right.
And so that was 3 years later.
Right.
Second time.
Yeah, I can give you guys 5 minutes break to go have food, please. It's in the backside. Then we can talk. As you can bring it to your table and we can talk. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I have a CPAP machine,
Mm-hmm.
so I can bring that to the hospital.
Yes, you can.
And when I see the anesthesiologist, just let them know I have a sleep. I have a
No, you can tell the nurse as soon as you go to the room, and they'll say, okay, you can use your own. Yeah, you don't even have to take any permission. Just bring it with you.
I know I'm supposed to put distilled water in it, but I rarely if ever do. Does that really make a difference? Well,
I don't know that. I don't deal with the sleep apnea itself. I tell patients to take care of sleep apnea, so it helps my AFib. Okay. Hey, can you make sure they're all writing their names and telephone number? I'm not sure if she's doing. I didn't see her. I didn't see her doing it. And just make sure you go all over and ask them to write. If they don't have it, just you'll have to put it on a piece of paper. Hi. Where is Bree, the other girl? I didn't see them writing their names.
I'll ask her if they have a sign-in sheet.
Yeah, I don't think she did. Maybe they forgot. Yeah, just take one of the paper at the back. Just get it.
I'll ask her.
Yeah, they're supposed to, even for their own purpose. Otherwise, they have to read.
Yeah, that's what I was curious. I feel like they should have a sign-in sheet.
Yeah. But these two people are doing on their own for the first
How
time.
many photos do you want from this one? I took a couple because
Just
I figured they're all
7.
gonna look the same.
Yeah, no, you don't have to. Later on, we can take me, Amber, and all like that, just so that we put it on the picture.
We had a weight loss thing now. I'm gonna go eat some.
I think they had the number. I think they had the pen. It's in my car. Yeah, I have a pen. I got a pen. Yeah. Control. The next thing we're going to talk about is what if the medications are not working? Like you're taking medicines. Initially you're started on medicine. I mean, we all start medicines first, because that we can do any time, right away. So if the medications are not working, or something you don't want to take medicines, or if you are not able to tolerate. There are some patients have baseline heart rate in 50s, and they're okay. But if we give them more medicines, then their AFib may be controlled, but when they're not in AFib, their heart rate further goes down to 40s and 30s. So then they can't tolerate it. So what if that? And what if you don't want to take medicines? Yeah, then the catheter ablation, you can consider catheter ablation. You don't have to always wait for medicines to work and go for ablation later. It is the normal thing we do, but you don't have to. That is the reason why the AHA, American Heart Association, the guidelines have changed last 7 years. Now it is class 1A indication. What class 1A indication means, as soon as you get diagnosed, you can go for ablation. At least we can tell you this option right away now. In the past, people used to say, oh, you have to wait, medication have to fail, and then go for ablation. But now we can give you this option right away at the first meeting. And it is better to do that because this is the knowledge you need to know. There were so many times patients have come to me late in the disease process and they said, nobody told me about this. My doctor did not inform me about ablation. I didn't know anything about ablation. So that is the reason this is class 1A indication. Whether you want to go ahead right away or wait for some time and then do it. Again, before it used to be what we called class 2A indication. That means first medicines fail, then you go for ablation. Now it is not the case because they did a big study called Cabana study. It went on for 10 years that showed that the procedure risks are very, very minimum. Before we used to say 2% risk of bleeding in the groin, bleeding around the heart, very low risk of stroke. Now we say less than 0.5% risk. So that is the reason they changed the guideline based on that long study which went on for 10 years. It showed that the ablation is minimally invasive and is very low risk factors, and we are doing them very quickly now. So you're not under anesthesia for too long. I do like from starting to beginning, my part takes about 40 minutes if it is only AFib. If it is in addition to AFib also atrial flutter, it may go for an hour, but only that much time. So your recovery is not going to be affected by long cases, long procedure, long anesthesia, and you can be discharged on the same day. I tend to keep people overnight just because my patient population here is elderly. They don't have enough help at home, or they need help, and they can have some issues from anesthesia. So I like to keep overnight, but it's becoming so fast and quick now. I jokingly say it should be drive-through now. So we are getting there. So that is the reason there should not be any inhibition to go for ablation and wait till the medications fail. That means you are losing the opportunity to get the best result from the ablation and waiting and going through these medication side effects. Okay? So, an early identification of the AFib is critical because the shorter diagnosis and ablation time has shown good results, and also have shown that better outcomes are in direct association with the markers of atrial remodeling. So what happens is when you have AFib, or for whatever the reason is, high blood pressure, valve issues, your upper chambers get dilated. but we convert you into normal rhythm and keep you maintain the sinus rhythm, these upper chambers remodel. They get back to, like, they shrink, they get in normal shape. So that is important. That makes you feel good, and that is the reason why, early treatment is important, because you're not letting all those changes continue for a longer time. Okay, and delayed diagnosis impacts treatment success. Like 57% of the patients have an increased risk of recurrence after ablation due to 2 years delay in seeking ablation. Like if you have two patients, like about the similar background, again, it's very hard to say two patients with a similar background. Everybody has different health issues and all. So if two patients, if you take the same weight, similar comorbidities, and if one comes ablation right away after diagnosis, one comes after 2 years, 50% of the patients are increased risk of having more and more AFib. So that is why most of them end up needing ablation. So ablation is needed pretty much all the patients with AFib, unless you just want to stay in AFib. So you rather get it done early and get the best results of the ablation and have this minimum irreversible changes to your upper chambers. Okay. And these are the other things. Early ablation for AFib reduces up to 60% of the CVA effects, like less strokes. See, again, one more thing, I am telling it very clearly, ablation reduces the risk of stroke up to 5 times. Here it's saying 60%, but again, it does not eliminate the risk of stroke. Okay, even after ablation, you need to be on blood thinner or anticoagulants or have Watchman. Otherwise, you cannot stop these medicines. So just remember that. So a lot of patients come and ask me, then what's the point of getting ablation? Yeah, because it controls your AFib, reduces your risk of stroke, reduces your risk of heart failure, improves your quality of life. So these are all the benefits. Okay. So they get upset, then why do I have to keep taking blood thinner? Why am I getting ablation then if I have to take blood thinner still? Yeah, because it does not eliminate the risk of stroke.
So I think the other person that
Yes.
overall,
Yes. Metoprolol you can stop. Yeah. And up to 14% reduction in AFib related outpatient visit. Yeah, a lot of the people, they don't feel good when they have episode of AFib. They get anxious, they get short of breath, they feel dizzy, and they're going to like constantly to their doctors or urgent care or the ER. That reduced, and up to 26% reduction in post-ablation cardioversion. Some patients keep getting cardioversion, they think that helps. Cardioversion is just a temporary, then your heart has to stay in normal rhythm. Cardioversion does not help you to stay in normal rhythm long term. It's just an one time when we shock, we convert you, and then your heart has to stay in normal rhythm. The effect of cardioversion doesn't stay long. Okay, so but still, after ablation, the number of times they had to get cardioversion has reduced. Okay, and high efficacy and less complications with catheter ablation. Again, these are like, we are comparing different modalities of treatment, ablation and medication. They both have different kind of risk. Okay, you can't directly compare them, but still, with catheter ablation, like 74% patients were free of AFib occurrence, only 1% complication rate. Of them was like, tamponade means like bleeding around the heart, and then very minimum 0.1% phrenic nerve injury. And that is reduced again by if you do ablation using contact force catheter, like where we are able to figure out what is the amount of force we are applying when we touch the heart. So now with this new technology, we are able to do that. So these complications have further gone down. It's not even 1%, it's less than that, like 0.5% and all. But again, antiarrhythmic drug therapy, like 52% of the patients are free of AFib recurrence on medicines. And plus, they had about 28% of the people discontinued medications due to like adverse events, like tiredness, fatigue, and all that. 13% of them were stopped taking medicines because of the treatment failure, and 4.2% non-compliant. It's very hard to keep taking medicines every day, all the time. It's not easy, and you'll forget also. so so again, here it said 74% of the patients were free of AFib. That's from the old technology. Now up to 96% of the patients are free of AFib recurrence with new technology. Again, we are also going from here. We also have what we call pulse field ablation. That is a newer technology that we are going to start using in the hospitals here. That uses a different energy, and that is very specific to the cardiac cells. So that means by using that, these risk you're seeing, these complications like bleeding around the heart, phrenic nerve injury, even that is going to go away, because that energy is not going to affect any other cells than the heart cells. So this is further to help us reduce the complications and improve the results of the ablation. Okay. So I'm going to show you this video about the AFib ablation.
Catheter ablation is a safe and effective treatment option for patients with heart rhythms. Medications are ineffective and cause negative side effects, which may include fatigue, increased heart palpitations, dizziness, or stomach problems. Catheter ablation is a minimally invasive procedure to treat heart arrhythmias. The goal of the procedure is to restore the heart's electrical signals to a normal heart rhythm. Catheter ablation is a safe procedure performed by a heart rhythm specialist called an electrophysiologist. An electrophysiologist is a cardiologist who has completed specialized training for diagnosing and treating heart arrhythmias. During a catheter ablation procedure, a thin, flexible tube, or a catheter, is placed in a small incision in the leg, where it's then advanced up through a vein and into the heart. There are two phases during the radiofrequency ablation: mapping and ablation. During mapping, an electrophysiologist creates a three-dimensional image of the heart using specialized catheters in order to identify the area of abnormal electrical signals which may be causing the arrhythmia. In the second phase, ablation, the electrophysiologist directs a catheter to the targeted areas and delivers radiofrequency energy in order to create a small scar within the heart muscle. This will then block the faulty electrical impulses and restore normal electrical pathways in the heart. After the procedure, it's typical to resume normal activities within 3 to 5 days. The main benefits of catheter ablation are a reduction of symptoms and an improvement in quality of life without the side effects often associated with medications alone. To learn more about catheter ablation or to
Again, as I mentioned, like the risks are low, and you guys can take a look at the catheters that we use to do these procedures, because a lot of people are afraid. They're like, what are they doing? They're going in my heart. So I want you to feel these catheters. These are so tiny. The tip is like 4 millimeter. The mapping catheter is like a flimsy catheter. It's like with a tentacle, so it does not harm in any way. So you can take a look at it so you know exactly what we do. That is the catheter where we use the ablation. We, yeah, this is the mapping catheter. This is the mapping catheter with the tentacles, and that's the ablation. The tip is only 4 millimeter, and we use that to deliver the radio frequency energy.
Wow.
Yeah.
And it's, I guess it's very.
No, one by one. One first mapping, then ablation. We don't. I mean, first of all, it's not a cut. It's just an access. We go in one needle and put catheters through it, and other one we use it for the ice. It's another catheter. At the tip of that catheter has the echo, like to look at the heart. Yeah, yeah. Yes, yeah.
Do you want to talk about that? How you decide which catheter between Octave and Octrel?
Yeah, so we use I use more Octarate, and the other one that is like a, I don't know, it's like a fan. That one we use for the lower chamber more. Yes, that's not for AFib ablation. I don't use that. I use for lower chamber arrhythmias. No, these are just mapping catheters. They don't give any electrical energy. They just map the heart. They create an anatomy, and they also, by touching the heart, it tells if there is an abnormal signal. If there is an abnormal signal, it puts a different color to it. Okay, so the catheter ablation, I just wanted to give you a little bit of it's not an open heart surgery. We go from the groin, go to the heart, and these catheters are very they don't cause much of any damage unless you really want to cause damage. So nobody wants that. So you have to understand the risk is low. Basically, that's what I want you to feel it, so you know what is going in your heart. Okay, so catheter ablation is more effective than medication in restoring sinus rhythm, less side effect, improves quality of life, and may provide long-term solution than the medications, and may eliminate long-term risk of stroke and death normally associated with AFib. Again, death can happen from AFib if you go into heart failure, and it's not treated. So that is not in the initial stages. Okay. So how to know if catheter ablation is right for you? Again, as I said, you don't have to wait. You can directly go for catheter ablation. Or if you want to try medicines in the beginning, and if the medications are failing, or you're constantly feeling the symptoms, your symptoms are not controlled, or when you decrease the risk of stroke in future, you go for ablation. And again, as I said, for me, I like my patients to go for it early. Early is the better. Okay, and basically because at that time you're healthy, you're not sick from sick from AFib, you're not having shortness of breath, you're not in heart failure, so your recovery from ablation is quick. The overall procedure goes very safely, there are a lot of advantages of that, getting it done when you're healthy. This is some real patients talking about it, the testimonials about their experience.
I decided to have the ablation because my quality of life was just not there at all, not even hardly any of it.
After the ablation, I lost over 35 to 40 pounds. I feel good physically, mentally. I think if I didn't have the procedure, I think I would be working at a half speed.
Having the cardioversions and the ablations has made a big difference. It makes it a little bit easier to get around, to do things. We still like to travel. We try to pretend that we're not as old as we are.
I used to have to carry around some pills with me. And I have pills in my wife's purse, I have pills in the car, I have this like stash of pills just in case I have need for them. So the moment I threw all that stuff away, it was freaking amazing.
3 months even after the procedure that I really began to feel normal and live normally and kind of not notice anything. I'd get done with my day and go, oh, no symptoms, no fear of something happening during the day.
Okay, reducing the risk of AFib-related strokes. So as we mentioned, oral anticoagulation medications are called blood thinners, like warfarin, Eliquis, Xarelto, dabigatran, or Pradaxa. It can be used to prevent stroke. And the other ones, if you cannot take medications, left atrial appendage closure device, it's called Watchman. The way it is programmed, that as I showed you in the earlier slide, the part of the heart where the clot gets formed the most is called left atrial appendage, where 90% of the time clots get formed. We occlude that part of the heart with using this left atrial appendage closure device, Watchman. Okay, there are other devices also called Amulet that can be used too, but we use mostly the Watchman. It's because it's much easier, and more studies have been done on Watchman. This device is studied the longest in the history, for 10 years, and for 10 years before FDA approved it, and it's been 10 years since it's been approved. But still, a lot of people in this area do not know about Watchman, is because we just late here in Florida. So, yeah. It's like appendix of your body, how you have. It's of not much use.
Right.
Yeah, it doesn't affect any functionality of the heart.
Right. So it goes off movement.
Yes. So left atrial appendage closure implants require, it's one-time minimally invasive procedure that reduces the risk of stroke for lifetime. It's not like you have it, now you have to change battery or nothing like that. It's only one-time procedure, and that's it. And you don't have to take, after 6 weeks of Watchman, you can stop taking the blood thinner. Again, there are multiple steps to it. You have to go through it, and then you can stop taking when when we say, okay, you don't have to take it anymore. They are effective for stroke reduction, just like any other blood thinners. Studies have shown that they're comparable results. I mean, again, I'm not telling you that don't take blood thinner, just go for Watchman. Like as catheter ablation is class 1A indication, like from get-go I can say you can go for ablation, but for Watchman is not class 1A indication yet. It says that you have to, if you cannot take blood thinner, then you go for Watchman. So like for example, if you have bleeding, like gastric bleeding through the kidneys, or bleeding from any other organ or nose, or if you are a fall risk, you're not stable and you're fall risk, or if you have a very active, strong, active lifestyle like marathon runners or things like that. So all those things can put you at a risk of bleeding, and bleeding like bleeding in the brain or things like that. So then you can go for Watchman. So it is not like an alternative for blood thinner yet, but the results of the Watchmans are as good as the blood thinners in stroke prevention. And Watchman implant is safe and minimally invasive, does not require any surgery or anything. Procedure is again similar, it's done like in the hospital, just like minimally invasive. Just we go from the groin, go to the heart and left side of the heart, and we implant that. But again, before and after, we need to do TEE or CT scan to measure the size of the appendage. So we need to measure the size of the appendage to see if we can fit one of the 6 Watchman. Watchman has 6 sizes, so one of them has to fit there. So we have to do that before we actually bring you in for the main procedure. And afterwards, after 6 weeks, you have to continue taking blood thinner. After 6 weeks of Watchman, then we go back and say if there is any leak around it. And if it looks really good, then we say, okay, you can stop taking blood thinner.
What holds that Watchman into the appendage when I put it in before it rolls over?
So that is the reason why we measure. So if the measurement is like, we put the Watchman the size that once it goes in, it should have a little bit of compression so that it stays there, and the trabeculae inside the appendage, and that holds the Watchman. Okay, and that's why we do a lot of tests before we release it. We do what we call tug test, and we do the measurements. Like suppose if I put a Watchman and it did get compressed, but not good compression, then likely it may come out. So we again change the size. Again, if the compression should not be too much or should not be very little, so there is like percentage that they make us be in that range. If you're lower than that, it's not good. Higher than that, it's not good. So those are all the criteria that are set by FDA for us to follow, so it stays there.
Does that test require being hospitalized, or is that how just the runs to a size of
No, you don't have to stay in the hospital, but it is done in the hospital. You're in and out. Yeah, depending on your insurance, some of them I get CT scan. For some patients, I do the TE. Okay. So this is a video for that, so you can have some visualization of what we do.
This is the Watchman implant, a one-time procedure that may reduce your stroke risk for a lifetime. If you have non-valvular atrial fibrillation, or AFib, not caused by a heart valve problem, and need an alternative to blood thinners, the Watchman implant could be right for you. AFib increases your risk of having a stroke. In fact, on average, a person with AFib is 5 times more likely to suffer a stroke than someone with a regular heartbeat. That's because AFib causes your heart to beat irregularly, which affects its ability to pump blood normally. And when the heart doesn't pump as it should, blood can collect and form clots. If a clot escapes, it can cut off blood supply to part of the brain, causing a stroke. In people with non-valvular AFib,
Blood clots most commonly form in an area of the heart called the left atrial appendage, or LAA. Closing the left atrial appendage is an effective way to reduce the risk of a stroke in people with non-valvular AFib. The Watchman implant fits right into the LAA, completely sealing it off so blood clots can't form there and lead to a stroke. The Watchman implant permanently reduces your stroke risk without the use of blood thinners and the worries that come with them. If you take a blood thinner, you are likely aware of the bleeding risks that come with it. Most people can take a blood thinner for years without serious side effects. But because blood thinners help prevent clots by thinning the blood, they also increase the risk of bleeding. Sometimes bleeding can be serious or even life-threatening. For instance, you may experience internal bleeding or bleeding in the brain, which can cause a stroke. If you've experienced this kind of bleeding while taking a blood thinner, or think you're at risk for this kind of bleeding in the future, talk to your cardiologist about the Watchman implant. The Watchman implant procedure is safe and minimally invasive and doesn't require open heart surgery. With 20 years of clinical trial and real-world experience, including 10 clinical trials, the Watchman implant has a proven safety record. Similar to a stent procedure, your doctor makes a small cut in your upper leg and inserts a narrow tube, then guides the Watchman implant through the tube into the left atrial appendage. The procedure is done under general anesthesia. People who get the Watchman implant usually stay in the hospital for a day or less. After the procedure, your doctor will prescribe you a choice of either antiplatelets or blood thinners. During that time, your own heart tissue grows over the Watchman implant to form a barrier against blood clots until your left atrial appendage is permanently sealed off. Many people may be able to stop taking blood thinners immediately after the procedure, and in a clinical trial, 96% of people were able to stop after just 45 days. Make sure you talk to your doctor to understand the right medication for you and how long you'll be on them after your procedure. The Watchman implant is the #1 doctor-recommended left atrial appendage implant, and it can be a life-changing alternative to the daily use of blood thinners and the bleeding risks that come with them. Get your customized doctor discussion guide so you can talk with your cardiologist about whether the Watchman implant is right for you. Go to watchman.com/guide.
So who is the Watchman implant for? If somebody who has non-valvular AFib, okay, very few people have valvular AFib, like mitral stenosis from rheumatic heart disease. Only those patients are, not qualified for Watchman. Non-valvular AFib is the most common one in this country, so most of you have non-valvular AFib. And also, if you're experienced bleeding while taking blood thinner, or if you have non-valvular AFib, or if you're, again, as I explained, if your lifestyle makes you, high risk for bleeding, you can have Watchman. So who cannot have Watchman? People who have valvular AFib, or if you are taking blood thinner for other reasons, like if you have clot in your lungs or you have clot in your leg and you're supposed to take blood thinner for the rest of your life, then there's no point in getting Watchman done because you have to still take blood thinner. Okay.
So I had
No, you can have it. So you have aortic valve, right? That's what you mentioned to me. Your aortic valve was fixed. Aortic valve does not cause valvular AFib. It's mitral stenosis is the only thing that's considered valvular AFib. Mitral stenosis. Your valve is not the cause. And you also did not have rheumatic heart disease. No, yeah. It's not. It's not any valvular. I said, valvular AFib, it's only valvular AFib. I didn't say if you had any valvular issues. If you have AFib that is caused by the valve, like mitral stenosis. Yeah, but that didn't cause by your valve. Yeah. Yeah. Okay, now we all learned all the things. Now I'm going to quiz you guys, okay? We have to see how much you were paying attention. I'm just kidding. So we also have gifts. So make sure you put all your efforts in this, to the answer. Okay, so you guys like are moderating, like have to see which one, who answered first. Like if we have tie, then who answered first one, they get the prize, okay? You ready? Are you guys watching? Okay.
Yes.
Who said first? What did you say? True or false?
I said true.
Okay. But who said first? He said first. What did you say?
I said false.
Oh, okay. You said false. Okay. So you were second? Who said it second? Okay, you got it. Okay, yeah, you guys have to pay attention here. Don't look at me, look at these guys. So it's true. So you got 1 point. Okay. So you guys are ready now? Okay. Okay, so you answered first. No, you have to win, guys. Yeah, it's you go. Good. So others have to catch up now quickly. Next. Oh, sorry. Sorry about that. This won't be counted now. What Okay, go ahead. Okay. See, I don't know why it's coming at the same time. I have to blame this to Natalie. Messed it up. Okay, what complication can be reduced by undergoing left atrial appendage occlusion procedure or taking blood thinning medication? Yeah. Okay, this one didn't happen. Okay. Okay, so who said? Okay. Who do you think? Okay. Yeah, upper chamber. Okay. Okay, you got first. Okay. Okay. So I know you won. I have to have like the second person. Who is the second one? Who is the second one that answers the most correct and fast? Him? Okay. Okay, here you go.
Is it a watchman?
No. We don't give watchmen like this. We put it inside your heart. You're welcome. I just wanted to have some fun at the end. Sorry for messing those 2 questions. Any other questions? No. Yeah. Thank you. And we also want to announce we have our next talk, like this seminar is in March 11th, right? So you guys have that in your handout. So please come and attend or ask your friends and everyone else.